The Mega Man Zero series might not be the longest, only having 4 games, but the length certainly feels appropriate. It seems like it could have wrapped up in 3, but when it did come back for a 4th, it didn't feel forced and managed to wrap up the titular character's story in a way that I think everyone would agree is conclusive. It's a very complete experience, which can be rare given how sequel-focused other games can be, especially Mega Man, making the Zero games feel very special. And then there's ZX, which can hardly be called a series, only 2 games long, just barely qualifying for the definition, and so short that Capcom couldn't even justify it getting its own collection, it being packaged in with the Zero titles. More bang for your buck, I guess, and with them both being by Inti Creates, there's enough similarities to justify it, but as for why we're discussing it here, it's because it's time for another ranked list of games, and while I really would prefer to give each series their own video, me just saying which ZX game I prefer over the other is going to be really short-lived. So hey, if Capcom did it, I guess I can too. It's not like it'll require too many mental gymnastics to figure out how this list would have played out had it been 2 videos, so hey, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and this is how I'd rank the Zero ZX games, based off of my own preferences. Okay, so my first placement might be a bit controversial, ZX Advent at the very bottom, number 6. A lot of people seem to like this more than the original ZX, but I strongly disagree. The first one had a crappy map, and while this one's an improvement, it can still be a mess figuring out where to go. Heck, partway through the game, they just start letting you warp directly into levels, like a proper stage select, before ripping it away from you again, so it kinda feels like they knew the Metroidvania thing was a flop, but for some dumb reason just refused to give it up. It also has some of my most hated levels for any Mega Man title. One with some of the most aggressive wind I've ever seen, a sub-boss with Beyblaze that it used to block, along with an energy shield giving you very little chance to attack, and a maze through literal trash. I also hate the set of bosses, there being no middle ground for me. Either they're a real pain in the butt, or a total pushover. And while the bigger roster of transformations also seems like it should be a selling point, I just hate using any of them other than Model A and ZX. When it comes to the pseudoroids, when an obstacle turns up that I need one for, I typically just change to one quick, do what I need to do, then immediately turn into one of the humanoids again, making the whole thing just a 30-second speed bump. While this wouldn't be too big a deal on the DS with its touchscreen, the right stick controls on the console releases make it lose a lot of its fluidity. And yes, I know there's advanced tech for using each of these guys. I've seen videos on Buckfire and Bifrost, but if I don't like the game, I'm not gonna take the time to learn the ins and outs. Call it a skill issue if you want, but another aspect I hate that can't be classified that way is just how miserable I find the world and how stupid the plot comes off. ZX had a silly, Saturday morning cartoon feel to it, using a bunch of anime cliches, whereas the Zero series dealt with some pretty heavy subjects by contrast and made you think. ZX Advent seems to be going for both, having an end-of-the-world scenario, more dire straits and depressing locales, and people being cruelly sacrificed for a madman's ambitions, all the while talking about becoming the Mega Man King, having a flower boss with a huge phallus, and using some pretty stereotypical accents at points. That last one might have been more the fault of the game's horrible dub, but it does it no favors. Then there's the 4 Guardian stand-ins, a quartet of insufferable turds that come off like entitled children who think they're just the most specialist because daddy told them so and bought them a shiny new toy that they did nothing to earn. The fact that rather than equipping the biometal they have, you having to turn into these pricks instead, it really hurts. I just don't want to play this game, doing so is awkward, and it has so many tone issues while trying to be serious that it feels like reading someone's bad fanfiction that they wrote when they were 15 and then sealed away. If this one happens to be one of your favorites, which I've heard a few people say, no hate towards ya, it's just not for me. At 5, I'd put Zero 2. A game that I don't like, but think I could eventually. It's a sequel that majorly improves upon the original. There's a proper stage select, you're actually allowed to use your extra lives, and you aren't forced to watch the same cutscenes over and over again. There's also a little less grinding required, or at least encouraged, and it's got some pretty fun gameplay as well. Jumping on top of an enemy armada and making your way to the flagship's cockpit is pretty darn cool, and I love using the chain rod to grapple hook around. And yet, there are some sequences that feel like they go on for way too long, like the mines in the snow level, the invisible platforms you have to toggle on and off in the mines, the ladders over spikes that you have to shift between in the final level, and the Fire Temple, with its lack of checkpoints outside of the boss hallway, making it the bane of my existence. I'm also not a fan of the frog boss, since the caterpillar spawns that power him up and his attack patterns when he gets huge feel random. None of these things are insurmountable on their own. They just go on to the point where the challenge seems to be, if you make the player do anything enough times, even if it isn't terribly hard, they'll probably screw up somewhere, and if it requires a perfect run, well, that's one way to pad the runtime. In addition to that, while I do like the story, it feels less like its own self-contained thing, and more to be largely the setup for the third game, which leaves me feeling a little dissatisfied. And speaking of dissatisfied, why is El Piso's first form slightly harder than Copy X's, then his final one is one of the easiest fights in the game? I think if I practiced this one enough, I could get to the point where, while I might not be over the moon about it, I could at least get the more annoying points down enough so that them hanging over me doesn't bring down my entire playthrough. For the time being though, it's the only title that has me feeling a bit of dread when it comes to playing through this series. At 4, we have the game that should probably be at the bottom, but I still really do like it, so it manages to beat out at least a few. The original Zero title. Yeah, it doesn't let you game over but makes you reload your save if you run out of lives. Yeah, it doesn't let you skip cutscenes, even if you just watched the same one not 5 minutes ago. And yeah, the kind of almost Metroidvania setup that has you revisiting the same few areas and needing to grind are a bit of a chore, but darn it, it's got style and sweet moves. The bosses look awesome, pull from various mythologies, and just about all of them show up in later titles because they were just too cool to be one-offs. While it's a little weird how the missions just have vague descriptions, at the same time, since a lot of these branch out from the earlier ones, you have more freedom with the order you tackle them in compared to the next two games. The weapons require more grinding, yes, but if you're an idiot and use only your sword, it feels really overpowered by endgame. This is also the only one with a self-contained story, so you can play this without worrying about what happens in the other games. And, perhaps most significantly, this is the only title where all 4 of the 4 Guardians are bosses. You might think with a name like that, it would be more common, but nope. Plus, with save assist turned on, the majority of my complaints are nullified, taking a game that's kinda pretty decent, I guess, to actually really darn good. While there is a good bit of room for improvement here, I think it's a really strong start for the series, and I have a good deal of fun playing it. At 3 is ZX, and it almost made 2. I'm aware of the game's issues, like the map, the really boring tutorial, getting around, no health refills during the boss rush, something else about navigation, but all of that doesn't compare to how fun the game is to play. I love the Zero games, and the 4 Guardians were a big part of that. They just had such cool designs and fun fights. By equipping the biometals, you essentially get to play as them. And with all their unique abilities, it's a blast to do so. And yes, I know I complained about this in Advent, but not only do the costumes here match the original designs a lot more closely, I think there's also a significant difference in cosplaying something yourself and role-playing as a bunch of snooty jerks while wearing their hand-me-downs. And if none of these forms are your cup of tea, you can always default back to ZX and pretend you're playing as Zero, just with a higher pitched voice. I also like the boss fights, since the weaknesses play a much bigger role here. I plain forgot about them in Advent, but here, they can be hard to avoid without a scan, and if you do know where they're at, you need to make a choice between going for the easy kill or trying to avoid damaging the biometal they're going to drop to save yourself some time repairing it later. I also prefer this iteration of the Prometheus and Pandora fights, you fighting each individually and then as a duo. I also really like the tone of this one. It feels a whole lot lighter than the Zero series, which is a nice reprieve. While the stakes are still high, it never seems to take itself too seriously. There's some power of friendship stuff thrown in and a simple but good message about finding your own path in life rather than letting others define it for you. This one feels like it's aiming for a younger audience, and that's reflected in the designs that resemble the style of the Zero titles but have some of the edges rounded off and are given a bit more of a gleam, giving the impression of toys. I would have loved to have action figures and playsets with these guys when I was a kid. The game just gives off such a feeling of jubilance, and while traversal leaves a lot to be desired, I could see the wide areas you have to explore being designed with the intent to get the players to mess around with the different forms, to get a feel for them and learn new tricks. So while I have some gripes with this one, I don't think I'm too many runs off from being able to mitigate them and just having a fantastic time, start to finish. And that soundtrack, mwah! Very few Mega Man OSTs can compete with this one, and the series just about always puts quality in those. At 2 is 04. It gets rid of a lot of the stress of the previous games, letting you just have one Cyber Elf you can reasonably use, not needing to level up your weapon skills, and letting you toggle on the harder boss fights for the EX skills rather than stressing yourself out about your ratings. Things are a lot more streamlined this time, so you can just kind of play without needing to worry too much about prepping or screwing something up for yourself. The levels can be pretty neat and interesting, like the one with the magnetic effects that can let you soar through the air, one where you try to find a base under the sea which is kind of like a maze, yet I somehow never end up getting stuck, a non-linear stage where you need to clear 4 paths in each direction, and one where everything is death, all spikes and pits, which, while frustrating, does feel really great to clear. And you can do the 8 main levels in whatever order you want, no parceling them out as you complete sections of the game. This one really feels like a gameplay first entry. I also really like the bosses, which have quite a variety in shapes and sizes, which in turn all lead to some pretty unique fights. There's also something about their designs that feel just a little different from the rest of the series, almost a bit sharper and grimmer, which feels odd to say given how edgy the Zero games already were. And while many of them are mustache-twirling evil, a few do have some unique motivations, such as loyalty and revenge, so they don't come across as one note. I also really like the writing in this one. It poses some interesting questions, like, is it better to live safely under oppression or freely in the shadow of death? Do you have an obligation to help those that are openly hostile to you, especially when their hostility comes from you disrupting their status quo by merely defending yourselves? Is Zero the fairest of them all? Not only that, but Vile is just an excellent and unrepentant villain that you really do feel willing to do anything to finish off. It is so rare for a Mega Man series to get an ending, and yet this one manages to wrap up everything so perfectly that 04 manages to not just be a great game to play, but also a supremely satisfying narrative experience as well. And number 1, at the very top, is 03. I feel a little bad picking such an obvious cliche, but popular things are popular for a reason. It tweaks several gameplay elements to make things more fun. Rather than just equipping an elemental chip and maybe a preset style, you get head, body, and foot chips that you can mix and match, either to suit your playstyle or just the immediate situation. There's a bit of a mixed handling of the Cyber Elves, you being able to equip up to 2 Satellite Elves to give you passive buffs, while still being able to sacrifice others for the standard boost, letting you actually use some of the power-ups you collect while still keeping that somber choice of killing the creatures you've been collecting for a bit of extra health just hanging over your head. The game even has a sort of built-in extra easy mode, even if you don't want to go casual scenario. Enter the cyber world for a bunch of Cyber Elf buffs, all without needing to kill anything other than your score. Not only is it a nice accessibility option, but it can also be a pretty fun power trip for those holding themselves back from using elves due to the moral aspect. Yeah, I know they're just data, but still. It has great level design, you riding rocket sleds across fields of snow, dashing across platforms sinking into lava, and making your way into a missile as it's launching. Each segment breaking off behind you as the warhead picks up speed. There's even some more atmospheric ones, like the flooded library where you seek out information on your current situation, and a sense of dread builds as you read more and more. The bosses this time might just be my favorite in any game, the 8 gentle judges being first and foremost. Each has a humanoid form, dressed in white with a gold lace cape, and just a smidgen of green that somehow adds to the sci-fi vibes. Then they have those black eyes with the pink irises that really leave an impression, and even in just their base forms, they're all really cool. When they transform, we get a range of creatures, very reminiscent of the X rosters. From a Cerberus with the extra dogs being detachable, a fox waifu that's actually a husbando, to a frilled lizard that can huck his extra flair around, to a frickin' cactus, and it all just kind of works. Despite how different each of them are, the sense of style is strong enough in this one that, if you lined them up next to each other, it'd be obvious that they belong in part of the same set. Visions of them even come back for the final boss of the next game, so it's clear the developers thought they were winners too. Several bosses from the first game also make a return, and like I said, they were all really cool. Plus, it's nice to give them another go in a more refined experience, returning to an origin point gives a sense of weight, and having a top tier set of bosses paired with the return of some fan favorites, each complete with new levels, it just really makes it feel like you're getting a lot out of this one. It kinda makes it seem like they were going for a finale with it, which is reflected in the writing as well. Both Zero and the Guardians have a lot of character development in this one, up to the point of what feels like a sense of closure. Not only that, but there's a really great twist and a memorable final boss that the game foreshadows pretty well throughout. And then there's the main antagonist, Dr. Vile, the most evil man who ever lived. He's such a great villain and I absolutely despise him. He immediately gives you creep vibes that make you wonder why someone hasn't already executed him, yet he manages to worm his way into the Neo Arcadia power structure. While he certainly seems like a problem, you don't even realize the full danger he presents until about halfway through the game when, after completing a pretty important mission, it gets cut short and you get a sinking feeling as you realize that your goal was actually Vile's goal, and if you didn't want the man dead before, you certainly do now. Vile's one of the loose ends that doesn't get wrapped up with the game, and while I certainly would have been happy with 03 being the last in the series, getting one more shot at him made me glad to come back. In fact, a lot of the writing that makes me think so highly of 04 gets its start here, from building up Vile to the general question of tolerating oppression. While 01 and 2 certainly had some good stories, 03 elevates this and keeps it going right into its direct follow-up. 03 fires on all cylinders, having fantastic gameplay, a sense of style, great writing, and just feeling like a celebration of the series, so it's easily my favorite on the list, and by a wide margin too. When it comes to these two series, I think very highly of the Zero titles. And obviously feel a bit more mixed when it comes to ZX. Maybe a third game would have solidified things for me. Either way, while some repeated playthroughs might cause me to appreciate a few of the titles a bit more, I'm feeling pretty good about this set of rankings. I don't see my opinions changing too much. While I do think they go a little heavy on difficulty at points, Inti Creates does seem to have a pretty good handle on the Mega Man franchise, and I'd love to see them get another crack at it at some point. Especially if Capcom themselves are otherwise engaged. So now I have to ask you, how would you rank these 6, and are any of my takes way off base? While I think my Zero placements aren't too controversial, I imagine some are going to have something to say about the ZX bits. That'll wrap things up for this week, so as always, thanks for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you enjoy Mega Man content. Hell's Gate open!